Hello, everybody. Good to see you again. We're back for round two here. So let's take a look at antebellum South and antebellum slavery. The second half of this lesson basically deals more with the experience of slaves. So in the first half, we looked at the experiences of slaveholders and why slavery was profitable and the economics of the antebellum South. So we're going to go a little bit different here. We're going to look at slave resistance, slave music, slave families, slave religion, a bunch of things like that. So in your notes, you should be on the section where it says number 7, slave resistance. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So let's first talk about slave resistance. So what we mean by slave resistance is, in what ways did slaves fight back? Obviously, being an enslaved person on a day-to-day basis was very difficult. There was a lot of poor treatment, and slaves are people, and they wanted to make their masters known in various degrees of ways that they were unhappy with their situation. So what I have up here on our slide is it says the significance of resistance, covert resistance versus more overt. So the word covert basically means secret. So when we talk about like secret ways that slaves resisted, this is kind of the resisting but not making it obvious. So when we talk about covert resistance, we're talking about maybe not working really hard. So most people in life work hard because they feel like they're getting paid, they might get a promotion. So slaves kind of had the mentality, well, if I work harder, how does that benefit me? So I'm going to try to purposefully not work as hard. That would be an example of covert resistance. Another example of covert resistance would be acting incompetent. So this is a method that sometimes teenagers use, right? So when mom or dad tells you to do a chore or to cut the grass or to do the laundry, one thing that teenagers learn is that if you do the job very poorly, that mom and dad will never ask you to do that again. So with slaves, sometimes they acted incompetent. If their master gave them directions, we want you to move that pile of lumber from that area to the other side of the field. Maybe the slaves would purposefully carry the stuff to the wrong location or not follow instructions. That would be a form of covert resistance. Sometimes there are stories from the antebellum era of poison ending up in the master's soup. So if you put 2 and 2 together, house slaves would sometimes try to poison their masters to kill them. All right. Sometimes it was successful, sometimes it wasn't. That's kind of a covert, secret way to show your displeasure at your master. Hey, there's a shed out on the plantation where all the equipment is kept. Somehow that equipment shed caught on fire and everything burned to the ground. How did that happen? Well, a slave probably secretly lit it on fire and didn't tell anyone, right? And then also, hey, you could just break the equipment. So if your master gave you like a shovel or something and said, okay, we need you to go out back to the swamp and dig a trench. Nobody's around. Maybe you take the shovel and you snap it in half with your foot. And you go back to the master and say, your master, I can't do the job today. The shovel broke. So those would be examples of more covert or secret resistance to slavery. But then there are more overt types of resistance. So for example, the most common and the one that you should be aware of is running away. Slaves did not have a very good chance of being successful when they ran away. But if you're a slave and you really want to show how unhappy you are, you could simply wait till nighttime, bolt into the woods, take your chances, knowing that you're probably going to get caught, but make it known to your master. You could scream at your master. You could attempt to, if your master hit you, to fight them back. But running away, screaming at white people, or like physically hitting your master, those things are going to lead to very, very intense consequences. Beatings, being locked in hot sheds, really facing torture. So those were things that as a slave, if you were going to resist, you had to make your choice how you wanted to do that. And some slaves just decided, it's in my interest just to fly under the radar, do what I'm told, and if an opportunity presents itself to gain freedom, I'll take that route. The next topic I want to move on to is a big one in the AP US History curriculum. It's the topic of slave revolts. So when we talk about the history of slave revolts, you kind of have to start in the 1790s with the Haitian Revolution. So if we look up here at my map, right, we see a map of the country of Haiti. So in the Caribbean, on the island of Hispaniola, part of that island is the country of Haiti, and Haiti has a unique history. The slaves in Haiti were inspired by the French Revolution. So from about 1790 to the year 1804, the slaves in Haiti overthrew their French masters, and they basically fought a war for independence. Now, the thing that makes the Haitian Revolution so historically significant is the slaves won that war for independence. So Haiti is the only country in the world that was basically formed by slave revolt, right? So what happened was news of the success of the Haitian Revolution spread all over the world. So not too far from the Caribbean was the American South, right, where all these United States plantations were, the Antebellum South, right? So there were a number of slave revolts that occurred because American slaves were so inspired by the success of the Haitian Revolution. So the first name we're going to examine here is the name Gabriel Prosser, right? So on the notes here we see Gabriel, right? So Gabriel Prosser was a slave in Richmond, Virginia. And Gabriel Prosser basically planned a slave rebellion. But what happened was a couple other slaves ratted him out to whites. And before Gabriel could carry out his rebellion, he was caught. And then if you consult your notes there, you'll see kind of what happened to him. Gabriel Prosser and 25 of his followers were hanged. So it didn't end too well for him. Okay. Now the second name we're going to look at here is this name Denmark Vesey. So in 1822 in South Carolina, this man Denmark Vesey basically tries to plan a rebellion. Black man, slave. So same thing happens as in Gabriel's rebellion. So a couple slaves kind of catch word of Denmark Vesey's planned rebellion. They rat him out to, the white slave class. And if you look at your notes with Denmark Vesey, it says 2 slaves leaked the information to white masters, and Vesey and his 35 followers were hanged. Okay? So instead of really studying the individual details of Gabriel Prosser's potential rebellion and Denmark Vesey's potential rebellion, what I want us to do is focus on the big picture. So what did these rebellions have in common? Okay, so number one, both Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser were both very religious slaves, and they were considered religious leaders in their black communities, respectively. Secondly, both of these enslaved men were literate. And that's really important because there's a couple trends we see here. We know that both Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey had knowledge through reading of the Haitian Rebellion. So the big trend we see here is the more literate slaves were, the more they were aware of the world around them. And the important thing is the more that these slaves were aware of the world around them, the more likely they were to rebel. So there was a direct link between literacy, education, knowledge about the world, and a tendency to rebel. So in your notes, you guys should put a huge star and a huge highlight next to this event, the Nat Turner Rebellion. I would make the argument that in the antebellum South, the Nat Turner Rebellion is the most important event that occurs during the entire pre-Civil War era. So in 1831, there was a very religious slave. Do we see the trend here, right? Religion. Nat Turner. So Nat Turner was a religious slave he was a preacher, and he made many claims throughout his life that he saw visions from God. So Nat Turner makes the claim that he is getting visions from God as an enslaved man. These visions are telling him to rebel. So Nat Turner goes ahead and he recruits a group of followers. And in this location, Southampton, Virginia, him and his followers go out and over the span of days and weeks, they murder every white person that they can get their hands on. So if you consult your notes, it says Nat Turner and a group of 70 slaves roamed the Virginia countryside. They murdered white men, white women, white children. So over the span of this slaughter, 60 whites were killed. It got so ugly in Virginia that the state government had to call up the militia. And basically, Nat Turner remained a captive for 2 months. So he basically went into hiding. So they eventually found him. They hanged him. They chopped his bodies into pieces. 56 of the people who were associated with this slaughter, the Nat Turner Rebellion, were hanged. 56 of the slaves. So basically, this event sends off alarm bells throughout the entire South, right? They know that Nat Turner is influenced by the Haitian Revolution, by these earlier men who tried to carry out slave rebellions. But Nat Turner's rebellion is really the only successful slave rebellion in antebellum America. And it's really a huge wake-up call for slave masters. The idea is that the more freedom that you give slaves, the more likely a rebellion is to happen. So we see a huge clampdown on the rights of slaves and what they're allowed to do, and there's a huge ramp up in rules and regulations regarding slavery, and that all ties back to the Nat Turner Rebellion and the fear that more white people are going to get slaughtered by unhappy slaves. There's another key point here associated with the Nat Turner Rebellion. Southern whites looked for somebody to blame. Who's to blame for all these enslaved people rising up and wanting to murder? The group who was blamed were abolitionists from the North. Now remember, being an abolitionist in this era, somebody who wanted slavery to end, that was a dirty word. Abolitionists were hated both in the North and the South. They were viewed as radicals, they were viewed as troublemakers, they were viewed as people, who were encouraging slaves to rise up. So what happened was, following the Nat Turner Rebellion, these Southern whites look at these radical Northern abolitionists who only make up like 2 to 5% of the population, and they say if it wasn't those people causing trouble and stirring the pot and saying all those historically inaccurate things about us as slaveholders and all the awful things that we do, these slaves would have no desire to rise up. So make sure you know that abolitionists got a lot of blame for the Nat Turner Rebellion and other slave rebellions for that matter. All right, so let's go into these slave punishments a little bit, right? So if you're an enslaved person and you are rebelling, either covertly, right, secretly, or overtly, like something very open, like running away, you pretty much know that you are at the will of your master. In terms of when you get caught doing whatever you're doing, you're going to face some pretty extreme punishments. So the one punishment that has been highlighted throughout history and in TV and in movies is whipping. So if you look at those two pictures at the top right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see enslaved people who have their hands tied around a post, and then you see sort of like a white master with a lash or a whip really just hitting them on the back so hard, so many times that their skin is ripping open. Sometimes masters could make this worse by taking a bucket of salt water and throwing it on the ripped up back, right, just to make it especially painful. Some other punishments that maybe we should take note of: cutting off body parts. Hey, we're going to cut off your finger, we're going to cut off your toes, we're going to cut off your ear, we're going to cut off your tongue. Anything that kind of hurt and would impress upon a slave that they had done something wrong, that's what was going to happen. And as a rebellious slave, you kind of knew that these punishments were on the table, right? If you were a slave and you ran away and your master didn't want you to be able to run anymore, they might slash your Achilles tendon, right? Or they might cut off all your toes so that you hobble around, things like that. Branding. So maybe take a hot metal pole with a little design on the end, get the design, the mold really hot, and then burn the person's skin as a form of torture. Even castration. So they take male slaves and they would cut off their male parts, if you get what I'm saying, to kind of show dominance over them. Okay, we'll take away your manhood. So those were all really awful punishments, and they were all options for slave masters. But the big trend we don't want to lose sight of is masters really did not want to kill their slaves. Slaves had a lot of value, and slaves knew that, so they knew that they probably were not going to get killed. But slave masters could say, well, we're just going to torture you, or we're going to sell you away to somebody else who might beat the rebellion out of you. Okay, so those things were definitely options. But killing them, there's really only one way that slaves would be killed, and that would be either plotting or carrying out a violent rebellion. If you were caught planning or carrying out a violent rebellion, they would cut off your head, put it on a pole, and let the other slaves see it as a way to set an example. Okay, so let's highlight this word, slave codes. Okay, this is a term that could definitely show up on an exam. So slave masters really wanted to discourage rebellion, and that's really what we're getting at here, right? How, as an antebellum slave society, do you prevent enslaved people from rising up, getting violent, and killing? So the answer to that question was, well, you pass laws that basically restrict slaves in almost every possible way. So I think the best thing to do here would be just to go through some examples of laws that only applied to slaves. So first of all, no owning property. So you don't own anything yourself if you're an enslaved person. If you're an enslaved person and your master asks you to leave the plantation, you have to get a tag or a permit so that if somebody sees you walking somewhere off the plantation, somebody can ask, hey, where do you belong? And you produce documents and they go, okay, you may go. So supervision, right? Permit, travel permit, stuff like that. Slaves had a curfew, so you couldn't be roaming around past a certain hour at night, right? No large groups. They might pass a law in the South saying that if you're a slave, you can't be with a group larger than 3. Because if you're with a group larger than 3, it's pretty obvious that there's some plotting or some kind of rebellion going on. If you're a slave, you can't touch a weapon or a firearm. Off limits for you. You're caught touching any of that, severe punishments. All right. No hitting whites. So if you are getting attacked and you're getting beat by a plantation worker or a master, you are not allowed to fight back. A really important one was that if you were an enslaved person, you could never testify in court. So if your master was abusing you, if you were a woman, an enslaved woman, and you were being sexually abused, there was no legal recourse for you. You were not allowed to speak in court as an enslaved person, and a white jury was never allowed to take the testimony of an enslaved or a black person for that matter, right? Very important as well, no literacy. So these southern states passed laws saying you are not by law to ever teach your slaves how to read. So on the previous slide, we learned that Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner were all literate slaves. So slave masters knew that the more ignorant they kept their enslaved people, the less likely there was to be a slave rebellion, right? So there's this old saying, knowledge is power, right? The more knowledgeable you are, the more that you know about the world around you, the more likely you are to take action. That was absolutely true with slaves. The more literate and the more literate slaves were, the more inspired they were, and the more likely they were to rebel against their condition, right? So the big thing we want to take away from slave codes is every time there was a slave rebellion, every time slaves got violent, white masters in the South realized that new rules and restrictions had to be placed on enslaved people. So the big takeaway is that to prevent slave rebellions, the white South put very strict rules on enslaved populations. All right. This last topic here, even though it's not related directly to the antebellum South, it kind of comes about later in history and is related to slave code. So I think it's worth a mention. So in the post-Civil War era, which means after the Civil War, so once slavery ends, restrictions on black people do not stop. So I'm pretty sure that many of you have heard this term Jim Crow. So the term is Jim Crow laws. So there's about a 100-year period in the southern United States from about 1865 to almost 1965. So the 1860s to the 1960s. Once slavery ends, life for African American people does not necessarily get easier because southern states transition from slave codes to new laws that differentiate, here's what white people are allowed to do and here's what black people are allowed to do. And those laws that basically kept and maintained segregation in the South after the Civil War, but before the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, they were called Jim Crow laws. So if we look here, an example of a Jim Crow law would be, hey, there's a water fountain. But there's two different ones. There's one for white people and there's one for the term that was used back then was colored people, which is basically African American people, right? There is a school. This is a white-only school, and that's a black-only school, right? That would be a Jim Crow law. There's a lunch counter. Only white people are allowed to sit at that lunch counter. There's a public swimming pool. Only white people are allowed in that swimming pool. Those would be all examples of Jim Crow laws that existed between the 1860s and the 1960s. Kind of an outgrowth of those slave codes. And just a little fact for you, that name Jim Crow. Jim Crow was an African American character in those minstrel shows, those blackface shows. So the laws establishing different rights and abilities between white and black populations, Jim Crow, the name, is based on a character from those very racist minstrel shows. Our last slide of this lesson, in my estimation, really deals with the humanity of slaves. So here's the thing. As a human being, there are certain aspects of life that no matter what the condition of your worldly experience is, right? Human beings have certain things in common, right? So if you look at the topics of the slide, for example, right, things like music, your family, and your religious beliefs. Masters viewed their slaves mainly as farm animals. But from the perspective of enslaved people, they may have played the part or, not expressed themselves 100% truthfully when in the presence of their masters. But slaves had downtime. Slaves had time when they were around their fellow slaves and within their little sphere, within their little area of influence, right? Slaves tried to maintain their humanity as much as possible. So I think these three areas, music and families and religious beliefs, really tie into slaves trying to keep that humanity, even though they're not being treated like humans, right? So let's start off with music. For a lot of you, music is a fun thing. People like different styles of music, and they get in arguments about what type of music they like versus what type of music they don't like. One thing you should know is that almost every major form of American music, right, it somehow comes out of the slave field. So as slaves are working in the fields, they're singing these work songs. So a lot of times they would be like call and response. So you would have a couple bars of music where people would sing a certain line, and then there would be another group of slaves on the other side of the field who, after asking the same question or singing the same line over and over again, would respond to the other side. So basically singing was a way to pass time in the field. So there are some musical genres in the current, day that go back to that, passing the time in the slave fields kind of thing. And I'll go through each one. So a lot of these songs that were sung by slaves were religious in nature and were Christian in nature. So in today's world, we call this music gospel music, right? This really emotional church music, right? Like very heavy rhythm and blues element, that kind of stuff. Gospel music comes out of slave hymns, okay? Ragtime and jazz. So, ragtime and jazz aren't exactly popular musical styles in the moment, but jazz and ragtime are some of the first ever genres of music created in America, right? And elements of those genres come out of the slave field, right? I'll spend a little extra time on blues because, to be honest, I just know a little bit more about blues than the other genres. So if we take a look here at our picture, sorry. So this guy here, if you're somebody who's into like rock music or like, heavy metal music or something like that, right? This guy is considered, one of the founders of blues guitar, right? Robert Johnson. The famous saying about Robert Johnson was that he sold his soul to the devil to be able to play the guitar really well, right? A lot of famous guitar players, Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page and Stevie Ray Vaughan and all these, very famous classic rock and blues guitar players, a lot of them note Robert Johnson as being their primary influence, in terms of listening to old blues music. But if we look at that genre blues, right, blue means to be sad. So the experience of slavery was often very sad. So when you listen to blues music, the music itself, like, when you listen to somebody bend a guitar string in the blues scale, you'll get like the chills, or you'll feel that feeling of sadness within you, right? A lot of blues music works like the way that you play the music is that you build up a lot of tension, and that tension is released in the music. So it's constantly build up, build up, build up, release the tension. So a lot of like rock and roll and blues music, that's the basis of it. And basically that comes out of the experiences of slaves, being in the field, being sad, and music as a feeling, like feeling the music as opposed to just playing the notes. That's, where blues and jazz come in, and that's how it's linked to slavery. So let's move on to slave families. So one of the essential elements of being a human being is having a family. You have your parents, you have your aunts, you have your uncles, you have your cousins, you have your brothers, you have your sisters. So the thing that we should be aware of is that the slave family is not like the traditional, typical family. So when you guys think of your families, you think of maybe your mom, dad, if your mom and dad get remarried, your stepmom, your stepdad, something like that. You have your brothers and sisters, maybe half brothers, half sisters. Things are normal. You have grandma, grandpa, right? Now, slavery, one of the defining aspects of slavery is that at any time, at any moment, any day, you could be sold away. So as a little kid, you could be sold away 1,000 miles away and be put on a plantation and never see your family again. So this has major effects on the way that slave families develop. So for example, a lot of slaves do not have last names, right? If you think about it, what does your last name say about you? Your last name basically is a marker of who you are related to, right? The people in your family have the same last name. So on some plantations, the slaves did have last names. But on many plantations, the slaves had no last name. So a lot of the slaves, when they get their freedom following the Civil War, a lot of these slaves either pick their last name or they take the last name of their master, and that becomes their last name, okay? So in a larger sense, that this whole name thing, that example I just gave you, it kind of shows you, like, if you go on a plantation and you ask an enslaved person, who are your parents? A lot of the times the answer you would get is, I don't know. Hey, where's your family from? I don't know, right? So you don't have oftentimes these relationships. Sometimes you would have a slave child or like a person who was an enslaved person, and they were pretty aware that their master was their father. So for example, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had no idea who his dad was. He knew who his mom was. Frederick Douglass also knew that he was fairly light-skinned. So his mom never admitted it to him, but he basically put two and two together and realized that the man who was enslaving him was also his father. And he kind of had to live with that. And remember, his father wanted nothing to do with him. His father's his master and treats him like property. So I can only imagine the psychological impact that had. But I don't think looking at slave families is all depressing. Because in a way, if you don't know who your traditional family is, if you don't know who your real mom or dad is, if you don't know who your real sisters are, everybody's part of the family, right? You're all brothers. You're all sisters. So basically, if you're an adult slave on a plantation, you have to make sure that even though the kids aren't yours, all the kids on the plantation are not yours, you're all part of the same family. You're kind of like proxy parents. So the whole family and the whole community on a plantation has to stick together and make sure that the children are cared for and that they're getting attention and that they're being looked after. So instead of just saying, oh, this is my family, I'm not worried about anybody else. On the plantation, in the slave family, we're all related. We're all African Americans. We're all part of the same community. And we all have to pick up the slack to make sure that everybody is cared for. Grandma, grandpa, my fellow slaves my age, the kids, we're all in this together. All right? And then last but not least here, slaves and religion. So a little bit earlier in the school year, we learned about a major event in 19th century society called the Second Great Awakening. So during the Second Great Awakening, you see hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, become born-again Christians in the United States. Now, these born-again preachers that traveled around and told people to find Jesus and be born again, right? They didn't limit their preaching to white people. So born-again preachers, they preached under the mentality of everybody is equal in the eyes of God. So a lot of traveling Baptist preachers make their way to plantations in the southern United States. Prior to coming to the United States, slaves were not Christian. So in Africa, African people, the religious belief system was called animism. So animism was a belief in celebrating your dead ancestors and celebrating nature spirits. So when slaves were transported to America, they were not Christian. But one of the more perplexing aspects of slavery is that enslaved people actually converted to the religion of their masters. Remember, slaves did not like their masters, yet they did convert to the same religion as the group of people who were enslaving them, which is kind of weird. So the way I explain this is there were certain elements to Christianity that were very appealing to slaves. So for example, what day do people go to church? They go to church on Sundays. There was only one day of the week that slaves did not have to work. Sundays, right? So you start to associate Christianity with, hey, that's a day off. I have to go to church. I like church. I get to wear my nice clothes. It's the one day I don't have to work. So Sunday was a happy day for slaves. Okay. Also, when you think about Christianity, the promise is a glorious afterlife, right? If you're an enslaved person and your daily life is torture, right? What's the one thing that gets you through, right? Faith in that afterlife. Also the Bible, right? So even though a lot of slaves were illiterate, there were a lot of stories in the Bible that really rang true to slaves. So the Bible is filled with stories about hardship and never giving up and overcoming really, really difficult challenges put forth by God. So slaves kind of viewed this as a challenge. If you think about the Bible book, Exodus, right? The story of Exodus is an inspiring story about Moses leading the Jews out of slavery, right? Fighting back against those evil Egyptians and eventually getting their freedom. So a story like Exodus and the Passover story was something that really rang true to slaves and said, well, maybe we should fight back, that kind of thing, right? And just be aware that most human beings have questions about the world. Why is the world here? Where did we come from? And what happens when we die? Slaves look at Christianity and they find a lot of the answers to these questions in Christian teachings, right? And African American Christianity becomes a little bit different than white Christianity, right? More emotion, and there's more mixing of African traditions even within the Christian belief system. All right, everybody, we have reached the end of our lesson on the Antebellum South. I hope you took something from these PowerPoint lessons. If for some reason there is something I said during either of these lessons and you feel like you need a response from me to clear it up for you, shoot me an email, shoot me a remind message, and I will happily address any of your questions. Okay, just so you know as well, this is the last of new material before the end of the third marking period. All right, so we've reached the end of the third marking period. and I will keep in touch with you about your testing and how we'll handle that. Thank you.